Charles had always believed that his second marriage would be different from his first. After years of public scrutiny and personal heartbreak, he thought he had found peace with Camilla. They had been friends for decades, and their relationship had weathered storms that would have destroyed most couples. But on that cold November morning, everything he thought he knew about his wife began to crumble. The discovery started innocently enough. Charles was looking for his reading glasses in Camilla's study when he accidentally knocked over a stack of papers from her desk. As he bent to collect them, one particular document caught his eye. It was a bank statement, but not from any account he recognized. The amounts were staggering, and the transactions dated back years before their marriage. His hands trembled slightly as he studied the paper more carefully. Monthly deposits of enormous sums, all from a company called Meridian Holdings. He had never heard Camilla mention this company, and the amounts were far beyond anything her personal wealth could explain. Charles felt his chest tighten as questions flooded his mind. Where was this money coming from? And why had she never mentioned it? The rational part of his mind tried to find innocent explanations. Perhaps it was an inheritance she had forgotten to mention, or investments managed by financial advisors. But something about the secrecy bothered him deeply. In their years together, they had been open about their finances, combining their resources for their shared life and charitable work. Charles carefully placed the papers back where he found them, but the image of those numbers burned in his memory. Throughout the day, he found himself distracted during meetings and conversations. Every time he looked at Camilla, he wondered what else he might not know about the woman he had married. That evening at dinner, he watched her more carefully than usual. She seemed perfectly normal, discussing their upcoming engagements and sharing gossip from her afternoon tea with friends. But now Charles found himself analyzing every word, every gesture, looking for signs of deception. The woman across from him suddenly felt like a stranger. After dinner, Charles excused himself to his private office and spent hours staring at his computer screen. He wanted to research Meridian Holdings, but something held him back. Part of him feared what he might discover. Another part felt guilty for even considering investigating his own wife. The internal conflict kept him awake most of the night. The next morning brought no relief. Charles found himself questioning everything about their relationship. Had there been other signs he had missed? Other secrets hidden in plain sight? The foundation of trust he thought they had built now felt shaky beneath his feet. During breakfast, Camilla noticed his distraction. She asked if everything was all right, her voice filled with genuine concern. Charles looked into her eyes, searching for any hint of duplicity, but saw only the familiar warmth he had grown to love. This made his suspicions feel even more troubling. He spent the following days in a state of internal turmoil. Part of him wanted to confront Camilla directly and ask about the bank statement. But another part feared that such a conversation would irreparably damage their marriage, especially if there was an innocent explanation he had overlooked. Charles began to notice small things that had previously escaped his attention. Phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. Text messages she seemed to delete quickly. Meetings with people he didn't recognize. Each incident could be explained away individually, but together they formed a pattern that made him increasingly uncomfortable. The weight of his suspicions began to affect his daily life. He found himself making excuses to avoid social engagements with Camilla, claiming work commitments or health issues. The distance he was creating felt necessary for his peace of mind, but it also felt like a betrayal of their relationship. One afternoon, while Camilla was visiting friends, Charles returned to her study. This time, his search was more deliberate. He carefully examined her desk drawers and filing cabinet, looking for any additional information about Meridian Holdings or other financial irregularities. What he found exceeded his worst fears. Hidden in the back of her filing cabinet was a folder containing correspondence with lawyers, financial advisors, and business associates. The documents painted a picture of complex financial arrangements that spanned years and involved people Charles had never heard of. As he read through the papers, Charles felt his world shifting beneath him. The woman he had married, the person he thought he knew intimately, had been living a completely separate financial life. The scale and complexity of her hidden activities suggested this was not simply a matter of forgotten investments or undisclosed inheritance. The most disturbing discovery was a series of letters discussing payments and obligations that seemed to have nothing to do with legitimate business activities. The language was careful and coded, but the implications were clear enough to make Charles's hands shake as he read them. He photographed the most important documents with his phone before carefully returning everything to its original position. The evidence was now safely stored, but Charles felt no satisfaction in his detective work. Instead, he felt sick to his stomach and profoundly alone. That evening, Charles struggled to maintain normal conversation with Camilla. Every smile felt forced. Every casual comment felt weighted with hidden meaning. He found himself studying her face, wondering how someone could maintain such a convincing facade while hiding such significant secrets. The knowledge he had gained felt like a poison in his system. Charles realized that he could no longer pretend everything was normal, but he also wasn't ready to confront Camilla with what he had discovered. He needed more information, more context, before he could understand the full scope of what he was dealing with. As he lay awake that night, listening to Camilla's peaceful breathing beside him, Charles felt more isolated than he had ever felt in his life. The person sleeping next to him was both intimately familiar and completely unknown. The contradiction was almost unbearable. Charles knew that his life had reached a turning point. The comfortable routine of their marriage had been shattered by his discoveries, and there was no way to return to the innocent ignorance he had enjoyed just days before. Whatever came next would forever change their relationship and potentially destroy everything they had built together. The morning sun brought no clarity, only the grim certainty that he had to dig deeper. Charles realized that he was no longer searching for reassurance that his suspicions were unfounded. Now he was searching for the complete truth, no matter how painful it might prove to be. Charles spent the next week in careful observation mode, noting patterns in Camilla's behavior that he had previously overlooked. Her Tuesday afternoon appointments, which she claimed were charity meetings, always seemed to leave her unusually tense. The phone calls she took in her private sitting room were always brief and seemed to require immediate attention, regardless of what else was happening. The breakthrough came when Charles overheard a fragment of one such conversation. He had been walking past the sitting room when he heard Camilla's voice, sharper and more businesslike than he had ever heard it. She was discussing terms and conditions with someone, using language that suggested she was negotiating some kind of deal or arrangement. What struck Charles most was the tone of authority in her voice. This was not the gentle, sociable woman he knew from their public appearances and private moments. This was someone comfortable wielding power and making demands. The contrast was so stark that Charles wondered if he had been living with two completely different people. He began to keep a detailed mental record of Camilla's movements and communications. On Wednesdays, she always left the house at exactly 10 in the morning and returned by 3 in the afternoon. She never offered details about these outings beyond vague references to shopping or meeting friends. When Charles had occasionally suggested joining her, she always had reasons why that wouldn't be convenient. The pieces of the puzzle started connecting when Charles decided to follow her. On a rainy Wednesday morning, he watched from his car as Camilla left their home and drove toward the city center. Instead of heading to the shopping districts or any of their usual social venues, she drove to the financial district and parked outside a sleek office building that Charles didn't recognize. From his vantage point across the street, Charles watched as Camilla entered the building with the confidence of someone who belonged there. She wasn't visiting for a meeting. Her body language suggested this was routine, familiar territory. Charles felt his heart sinking as he realized that his wife had been maintaining a secret professional life that he knew nothing about. He waited for 3 hours before Camilla emerged from the building. During that time, Charles observed other people coming and going, trying to understand what kind of business was conducted there. The building directory, which he managed to read during a casual walk past the entrance, listed various investment firms and consulting companies, but none that he recognized or could connect to Camilla. The drive home was torturous. Charles followed at a safe distance, his mind racing with questions and possibilities. When they met for dinner that evening, Camilla cheerfully described her day of shopping and catching up with old friends. Every word felt like a lie, and Charles struggled to maintain his composure. That night, Charles made a decision that felt like crossing a line from which there would be no return. He hired a private investigator. The choice felt like a betrayal of everything marriage was supposed to represent, but he could no longer bear the uncertainty and deception that had invaded his life. The investigator, a discreet professional named Margaret Wells, listened to Charles's concerns without judgment. She explained that her job was simply to gather factual information, and that what Charles chose to do with that information was entirely up to him. The arrangement felt clinical and businesslike, which somehow made it easier for Charles to proceed. Within a week, Margaret had provided Charles with a preliminary report that confirmed his worst fears and introduced new ones he hadn't even considered. Meridian Holdings was indeed connected to Camilla, but it was just one of several companies she was involved with. The web of financial relationships was far more complex than Charles had imagined. The report revealed that Camilla had been operating as a high-level consultant for various international businesses, many of which seemed to specialize in what Margaret diplomatically described as regulatory navigation. The amounts of money involved were staggering, and the client list included some names that Charles recognized from newspaper headlines, though not always for positive reasons. What disturbed Charles most was the timeline. Many of these business relationships predated their marriage by several years, meaning that Camilla had been living this secret professional life throughout their entire relationship. Every conversation they had ever had about their future plans and financial goals had been based on incomplete and misleading information from her side. The investigators' report also included photographs from Camilla's office building visits. In these images, Charles saw his wife interacting with people he didn't recognize, all of them dressed in expensive business attire and carrying themselves with the confidence that comes with significant wealth and power. Camilla fit seamlessly into this world, suggesting she had been part of it for a long time. Charles found himself studying these photographs for hours, trying to reconcile the woman in the images with the person he shared breakfast with every morning. The contradiction was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore or rationalize away. The most troubling part of the report was Margaret's professional assessment that Camilla's business activities, while possibly legal, operated in ethical gray areas that could potentially create problems for anyone associated with her. Charles realized that his own reputation and position could be at risk if any of Camilla's activities ever became public knowledge. Sleep became increasingly elusive as Charles processed this information. He found himself lying awake next to Camilla, wondering what other secrets she might be harboring. The trust that had been the foundation of their relationship was completely eroded, replaced by suspicion and fear. During their daily interactions, Charles began to see Camilla's behavior in a completely different light. Her charm and social skills, which he had always admired, now seemed like professional tools rather than genuine personality traits. Her ability to deflect difficult questions or change subjects when conversations headed toward sensitive topics now appeared calculated rather than natural. Charles also started to question whether their marriage itself might be part of some larger strategy on Camilla's part. The social and political connections that came with being his wife would certainly be valuable to someone operating in the high-stakes business world that Margaret had described. The thought that his love and trust might have been exploited for professional gain was almost unbearable. Charles found himself wondering if anything about their relationship had been genuine, or if he had simply been a useful asset in Camilla's larger business operations. As the second week of his investigation progressed, Charles realized that he was no longer the same person who had accidentally discovered that first bank statement. The innocent trust he had brought to his marriage was gone, replaced by a cynical awareness of how completely he had been deceived. The most painful realization was that confronting Camilla now would be incredibly difficult. How do you ask your spouse to explain a secret life that spans years and involves activities you don't fully understand? How do you express betrayal about deceptions you discovered through your own secret investigation? Charles found himself trapped between his need for truth and his fear of the consequences that truth might bring. Every day that passed with the investigation continuing felt like another step away from any possibility of rebuilding trust. But stopping the investigation felt like accepting a life built on lies. The weight of his knowledge was becoming unbearable, but Charles knew he needed the complete picture before he could decide how to proceed. Margaret had warned him that her investigation was likely to uncover additional information that might be even more disturbing than what she had already discovered. As Charles prepared for the next phase of revelations, he wondered if there would be anything left of his marriage worth saving once all of Camilla's secrets were finally exposed. Margaret's second report arrived on a Friday afternoon, delivered in a plain envelope that Charles received with trembling hands. The investigator had warned him that the additional information would be difficult to process, but Charles was unprepared for the scope of what she had uncovered. The report revealed that Camilla's business activities extended far beyond simple consulting work. She appeared to be operating as what Margaret described as a high-level facilitator for wealthy individuals and corporations who needed to navigate complex international regulations and political relationships. The services she provided often involved arranging meetings, smoothing regulatory processes, and opening doors that would normally remain closed to her clients. What made this particularly troubling was the apparent use of her social position and connections to facilitate these business arrangements. Dinners and social events that Charles had attended with Camilla, thinking they were simply part of their social obligations, had apparently been carefully orchestrated business meetings in disguise. Charles felt sick as he read detailed accounts of how their joint social calendar had been manipulated to serve Camilla's professional purposes. Charitable events, cultural functions, and intimate dinner parties had all been vehicles for her to conduct business with clients who paid enormous sums for access to the social and political networks that came with being Charles's wife. The report included transcripts of conversations that Margaret had somehow obtained, though Charles didn't ask how. In these conversations, Camilla spoke about Charles in purely transactional terms, describing his social calendar, his political connections, and his influence as assets that could be leveraged for her client's benefit. Reading these transcripts was like receiving physical blows. In one conversation, Camilla discussed arranging a charity dinner specifically so that one of her clients could have informal access to certain political figures. She spoke about Charles's schedule and social commitments as if they were inventory in a business she was managing. The most devastating transcript involved Camilla explaining to a client how her marriage provided the perfect cover for her business activities. She described Charles as completely unaware and perfectly positioned to provide the social access her clients needed. The casual way she discussed manipulating his trust and goodwill felt like the ultimate betrayal. Charles had to stop reading several times as the emotional impact of these revelations overwhelmed him. The woman he had married and trusted had been systematically exploiting their relationship for financial gain. Every social event they had attended together, every introduction he had facilitated, every charitable cause they had supported together had potentially been part of Camilla's business operations. The financial scope of these activities was staggering. Margaret estimated that Camilla had earned millions over the years through her facilitating work, money that had been hidden in complex offshore arrangements and shell companies. The lifestyle she enjoyed, which Charles had assumed was funded through their combined resources, and her personal wealth, was actually supported by income from activities he knew nothing about. Margaret's report also revealed that some of Camilla's clients were individuals and organizations that operated in legal gray areas. While her activities might be technically legal, they involved facilitating access and influence for people whose own business practices were questionable at best. Charles realized with growing horror that his own reputation could be severely damaged if these connections ever became public knowledge. His position and influence, which he had always tried to use responsibly for charitable and social causes, had been quietly leveraged to benefit people whose goals might be completely contrary to his own values. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Camilla had been sharing information about Charles's private conversations and planned activities with her clients. Details about his political views, his social plans, and his personal opinions had all been commodified and sold as intelligence to people who could use such information for their own purposes. This violation of privacy felt almost worse than the financial deception. Charles had always believed that his home was a place where he could speak freely and express his honest opinions without worrying about how those thoughts might be used against him. Learning that his most private moments had been monetized felt like a complete violation of everything marriage was supposed to represent. The report included photographs from surveillance of Camilla's business meetings that showed her comfortable confidence in these professional environments. She was clearly respected and valued by her clients, suggesting that her services were both effective and in high demand. The businesswoman in these photographs was completely different from the supportive wife Charles interacted with at home. Charles began to understand that he had been living with someone who was essentially leading a double life. The public persona of a devoted wife and charitable supporter was just a cover for a sophisticated business operation that exploited the very relationship it appeared to celebrate. The realization that their entire marriage might have been a business strategy was devastating. Charles found himself questioning every moment of affection, every shared laugh, every intimate conversation they had ever had. Had any of it been genuine? Or had he simply been an asset being managed by someone who saw him as a means to an end? Margaret's report concluded with a warning that there were likely additional layers to Camilla's activities that would require more extensive investigation to uncover. She suggested that what they had discovered so far was probably just the surface of a much more complex operation. Charles spent the weekend alone, having made an excuse about needing time for reflection and preparation for upcoming responsibilities. He used the solitude to read through Margaret's report multiple times, trying to process the full scope of how completely he had been deceived. The most painful aspect was realizing how skillfully Camilla had manipulated his emotions and trust. Her ability to present herself as a loving, supportive partner while simultaneously exploiting their relationship for profit demonstrated a level of calculation and deception that Charles found almost inhuman. He began to see patterns in their relationship that he had previously interpreted as evidence of Camilla's love and devotion. Her enthusiastic support for his social commitments, her eagerness to host dinner parties and attend charitable events, her interest in his political connections and professional relationships, all of these had apparently been motivated by business considerations rather than personal affection. Charles found himself grieving not just for the loss of trust in his current relationship, but for the realization that the relationship he thought he had been building for years had never really existed. The shared dreams, mutual support, and emotional intimacy he had believed in were revealed to be illusions carefully maintained for professional purposes. As he prepared to receive Margaret's final report, Charles understood that his marriage was already over in everything but name. The question now was not whether he could rebuild trust with Camilla, but whether he could find a way to extricate himself from the situation without destroying his own reputation and position in the process. The woman he had married had proved to be far more sophisticated and dangerous than he had ever imagined, and Charles realized that confronting her would require careful planning and strategy. He was no longer dealing with a spouse who had made mistakes or kept secrets. He was dealing with someone who had built a career on manipulation and exploitation. Now Margaret's final report arrived with a personal note warning Charles to prepare himself for information that would be particularly difficult to process. She had uncovered what she described as the operational heart of Camilla's business activities, and the implications were more serious than anything they had previously discovered. The most shocking revelation was that Camilla had been recording their private conversations for years. Hidden recording devices had been installed throughout their home, capturing not just Charles's words, but also those of any guests who visited them. These recordings were then transcribed and analyzed for information that could be valuable to her clients. Charles felt physically ill as he read detailed descriptions of how his private thoughts and opinions had been cataloged and commodified. Personal conversations about his views on political issues, his assessments of various public figures, and his private concerns about policy matters had all been turned into intelligence products that Camilla sold to interested parties. The technical sophistication of this surveillance operation was staggering. Professional-grade recording equipment had been seamlessly integrated into their home's infrastructure, suggesting that this had been planned and implemented over an extended period. Charles realized that there had probably never been a truly private moment in his own home. Margaret had managed to obtain samples of the transcripts that Camilla provided to her clients. Reading his own words taken out of context and packaged as insider intelligence made Charles feel violated in ways he had never experienced. Comments he had made during casual conversations were presented as authoritative statements about policy directions and political strategies. The client base for this intelligence service included foreign business interests, political organizations, and wealthy individuals who could benefit from advanced knowledge of policy discussions and political developments. Charles began to understand that his home had essentially been turned into an intelligence-gathering operation serving people whose interests might be directly contrary to those of his own country. The financial records Margaret had uncovered showed that this surveillance operation was by far the most lucrative aspect of Camilla's business activities. The amounts paid for access to Charles's private thoughts and advanced knowledge of his activities dwarfed the income from her other facilitating services. What made this betrayal even more devastating was evidence that Camilla had been sharing not just Charles's words, but also his planned activities and private schedule information. Clients had been paying for advance notice of his travel plans, meeting schedules, and even his health information. This level of access could have put his safety and security at serious risk. Margaret's investigation had also revealed that several recent social events at their home had been specifically designed to capture conversations between Charles and particular guests. Dinner parties that Charles had enjoyed as pleasant social occasions had actually been elaborate intelligence-gathering operations, with the guest list carefully curated to generate conversations that would be valuable to Camilla's clients. The report included evidence that Camilla had been manipulating Charles's social schedule to create opportunities for intelligence gathering. She had encouraged certain friendships and social connections while subtly discouraging others, all based on the potential value of the information that could be obtained from different relationships. Charles realized with growing horror that some of the most intimate conversations of his marriage had probably been calculated efforts by Camilla to extract specific information. Questions that had seemed like natural expressions of interest in his thoughts and feelings were revealed to be sophisticated intelligence-gathering techniques. The investigation had uncovered training materials that showed Camilla had received professional instruction in conversation techniques designed to extract information without raising suspicion. The woman he had trusted with his deepest thoughts had been using professional spy techniques to manipulate him into revealing information that she could then sell to the highest bidder. Margaret's report indicated that this operation had been so successful that Camilla was considered one of the most valuable intelligence sources in her network. The quality and reliability of the information she provided had made her indispensable to clients who were willing to pay enormous sums for insider access to Charles's thoughts and plans. The personal cost of these revelations was almost unbearable. Charles began to question every memory of their relationship, wondering which moments had been genuine expressions of affection and which had been professional performances designed to maintain her access to valuable information. The report also revealed that Camilla had been sharing personal details about Charles's health, his family relationships, and his private concerns with her clients. Information about his emotional state, his personal fears, and his intimate thoughts had all been packaged and sold as intelligence products. Charles found himself struggling with feelings of rage and betrayal that were unlike anything he had ever experienced. The systematic violation of his privacy and trust over such an extended period felt almost impossible to comprehend. The woman he had shared his bed and his life with had been treating him as an intelligence asset rather than a husband. The technical evidence suggested that the surveillance operation was ongoing and had probably been expanded over time. More sophisticated equipment had been installed recently, indicating that Camilla was continuing to develop and improve her intelligence-gathering capabilities even as their marriage had seemed to be growing stronger. Margaret's final assessment was that Charles had been the victim of what amounted to a long-term espionage operation conducted by someone with professional training and sophisticated resources. The scope and duration of the operation suggested that it had been planned from the very beginning of their relationship. The most devastating realization was that their entire marriage had likely been built around Camilla's need to maintain access to Charles as an intelligence source. Every expression of love, every moment of apparent intimacy, every shared experience had potentially been calculated to maintain her position within his life and continue her access to valuable information. Charles understood that he was not just dealing with marital problems or even serious deception. He was dealing with someone who had essentially been conducting an intelligence operation against him for years. The personal and professional implications were staggering, and the potential damage to his reputation and position could be catastrophic if any of this information ever became public. The evidence also suggested that Camilla's clients included some individuals and organizations whose interests could be hostile to Charles's own country and responsibilities. This meant that sensitive information about policy discussions and political developments had potentially been shared with people who could use it to harm national interests. As Charles absorbed the full scope of what Margaret had discovered, he realized that he was facing the complete destruction of everything he had believed about his marriage and his life. The person he had trusted most in the world had been systematically betraying him for financial gain, and the implications of that betrayal extended far beyond their personal relationship. The question now was not how to repair their marriage, but how to protect himself and minimize the damage that had already been done. Charles understood that he needed legal advice and possibly security consultation before he could even consider how to confront Camilla with what he had learned. The woman sleeping next to him each night was not his wife in any meaningful sense. She was an intelligence operative who had been conducting a long-term operation against him. The realization was so profound and disturbing that Charles wondered if he would ever be able to trust anyone completely again. Charles spent 3 sleepless days processing Margaret's final report before he could bring himself to take action. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but the emotional impact of learning that his entire marriage had been an elaborate deception was almost paralyzing. However, he knew that delay would only make the situation worse and potentially more dangerous. His first step was to consult with his most trusted legal advisor, someone who had served his family for decades and could be relied upon for both discretion and sound judgment. The meeting took place away from his normal offices, in a private location where there was no possibility of surveillance or eavesdropping. The lawyer's reaction to Margaret's evidence was immediate and grave. He explained to Charles that he was potentially dealing with criminal activity that could have national security implications. The systematic collection and sale of private information from someone in Charles's position could constitute espionage, regardless of whether the buyers were foreign nationals or domestic clients. The legal advisor recommended immediate consultation with security services to assess the potential damage and determine whether any of the information Camilla had gathered and sold posed ongoing risks. This conversation forced Charles to confront the reality that his personal crisis had implications far beyond his own life and marriage. The security consultation revealed the full scope of the damage that had been done. Experts who reviewed Margaret's evidence concluded that sensitive information about policy discussions, political relationships, and strategic thinking had indeed been compromised over an extended period. The potential impact on ongoing negotiations and political relationships was serious enough to require immediate damage assessment and mitigation efforts. Charles learned that he would need to inform senior officials about the compromise, which meant that his personal humiliation would become a matter of official record. The prospect of having to explain how he had been deceived so completely was almost as painful as the betrayal itself, but he understood that his duty required full disclosure regardless of personal cost. The most difficult conversation was with his security chief, who had to be told that the protective measures they had put in place over the years had been completely undermined by someone with unlimited access to Charles's private life. The irony that his greatest security threat had been sharing his bed every night was not lost on anyone involved in the assessment. Armed with legal advice and security guidance, Charles finally felt prepared to confront Camilla. However, his advisors had warned him that this conversation needed to be carefully managed to preserve evidence and protect against any further damage. The meeting would need to be recorded, and security personnel would need to be nearby in case the situation escalated unexpectedly. Charles chose to confront Camilla in his private study on a Tuesday evening when they would normally be having a quiet dinner together. He had spent hours rehearsing what he would say, but nothing could have prepared him for the actual moment when he looked across at the woman he had trusted completely and began to present the evidence of her systematic betrayal. The confrontation began with Charles simply placing Margaret's reports on the table between them and asking Camilla to explain what he had discovered. For a moment that felt like hours, she simply stared at the documents without speaking. When she finally looked up at him, Charles saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before. Not guilt or shame, but cold calculation. Camilla's response was unlike anything Charles had expected. Instead of denial or emotional appeals, she calmly confirmed the accuracy of Margaret's findings and began to explain her activities as if they were perfectly reasonable business arrangements. She spoke about the value of the access she had provided to her clients and the professional skill required to manage such operations successfully. What shocked Charles most was her apparent complete lack of remorse. Camilla described their marriage as a mutually beneficial arrangement that had provided her with business opportunities while giving Charles the companionship and social support he had needed. She seemed genuinely surprised that he was upset about activities she characterized as simply making efficient use of available resources. When Charles asked about the recordings and surveillance, Camilla explained that such documentation was necessary for providing reliable intelligence to her clients. She spoke about the technical challenges of installing and maintaining the surveillance equipment with the same tone she might use to discuss redecorating their home. The conversation continued for almost 2 hours, during which Charles realized that he was talking to someone whose moral framework was so fundamentally different from his own that meaningful communication was impossible. Camilla understood intellectually that he was upset, but seemed unable to comprehend why he considered her activities a betrayal of their relationship. When Charles asked whether any aspect of their relationship had been genuine, Camilla seemed to consider the question seriously before explaining that personal feelings and professional activities were separate matters in her mind. She claimed to have genuine affection for him, while simultaneously viewing him as her most valuable professional asset. This compartmentalization was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire confrontation. Charles realized that he had been living with someone who could genuinely care for him as a person while systematically exploiting him for professional gain, apparently without seeing any contradiction between these two positions. The conversation ended when Charles informed Camilla that he had already shared Margaret's evidence with legal and security advisors, and that she would need to deal with the consequences of her activities through official channels. Her response was to express disappointment that he had chosen to escalate what she viewed as a private matter that could have been resolved through discussion. In the days that followed, Camilla moved out of their shared home with the same efficient professionalism she had apparently brought to all aspects of their relationship. There were no emotional scenes or dramatic confrontations. She simply organized her departure as if it were another business transaction to be managed effectively. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy, but ultimately resulted in significant consequences for Camilla and her business associates. The investigation uncovered an international network of individuals involved in similar activities, and Charles's case became part of a much larger effort to address the national security implications of these operations. The personal cost to Charles was enormous. The public disclosure of how completely he had been deceived was humiliating and damaged his reputation significantly. The knowledge that his private thoughts and conversations had been compromised for years made it difficult for him to trust anyone fully ever again. The most lasting impact was the realization that someone he had loved and trusted completely had been capable of such systematic deception. Charles found himself questioning his judgment about people and relationships in ways that affected every aspect of his life. The innocent trust he had brought to his second marriage was gone forever, replaced by a wariness that he knew would color all his future relationships. In the months that followed, Charles slowly began to rebuild his life, but he knew that he would never again be the person who had accidentally knocked over those papers in Camilla's study. The discovery of her dark secrets had not only ended his marriage, but had fundamentally changed his understanding of human nature and the potential for deception that exists in even the most intimate relationships. The truth had indeed left him shattered, but Charles eventually realized that living with painful truth was far better than living with comfortable lies. The process of recovery would be long and difficult, but at least he was finally living in reality rather than in the carefully constructed illusion that Camilla had maintained for so many years.